All right, everybody. Today we're going to be going over Carl Schmitt's Political Theology. We're going to be continuing here our series with political sociology, political theory. I should have covered this a long time ago because it is a pretty, I think, fundamental text. It's referenced a lot. Um, it's a very short book, actually, so this video shouldn't be too long. I think this book has a lot of similarities with de Jouvenel's On Power, and if I were to recommend you to read this book, I definitely recommend you read it in uh, at the same time you read de Jouvenel's On Power because I think they supplement one another. That being said, let's just get it right into it. I don't want to waste anyone's time here, so here we go. Schmitt states that those who are sovereign, that is free, are those who decide the exception. This is understood in relation to the state's ability to make decisions in short notice and a quick manner, where only a small amount of people can mobilize the decisions at a time. Legal norms, or simply put laws, cannot decide on the exceptions themselves, as they are general rules for state conduct and don't account for the need of the adaptation in state action in themselves. So in other words, he's saying that those who have power are those who can make decisions in the public interest outside of what the law can account for, as oftentimes no law exists to deal with a very specific set of circumstances at play. This is very similar to when de Jouvenel spoke about how um, the religious foundations of law became undermined because the religious foundations of law were very static. They couldn't account for the change in public life. And this created an issue where if you had certain issues between people in society that the religious law couldn't really account for these issues. They couldn't account for how to deal with certain case by case problems because they had just these set in stone laws that were kind of just general rules that weren't very specific. They were sort of vague. Through this, it kind of became undermined over time, and religiosity of law kind of got pushed out. And after that happened, you had more, you know, the notion of God became undermined because people just kind of saw it as unnecessary. So the law itself is created by the sovereign as they make the decision to enact the law, and the act of decision is an act of sovereignty or freedom in this sense. What characterizes an exception is unlimited power to make decisions and the ability to suspend the existing order. For example, suspending the American Constitution for a period of time makes a person above the Constitution sovereign. In this case, the state remains, but the law does not. So the form of the state remains, that is like the principle of power, but the interiority of the state and like what the state does, that's what changes. The exception cannot be subsumed, which means it can't be beholden to something else or a part of something bigger than itself, as to be the exception is to be above all limitation, politically speaking. For law to work, there must be a conception of a normal state of affairs in society, or what Schmitt calls a homogeneous medium. Law, when created, presupposes or assumes society is a certain way, and it has to do this in order for us to apply law to society. We have to assume that society operates a certain way, people have a certain way of behaving, and this is sort of maintained over time. You can't have a law without that. However, men create law, and when creating law, it is also men who kind of decide what is considered normal and what isn't. There's limitations on that. Like they can't just say something completely abnormal is normal, or else like their whole system would be incoherent. But they kind of justify more or less what is considered normal and not normal. Uh, so when creating law, it, you can run into a lot of issues because you can mess up easily if you kind of miscalculate that. That's also another problem. Law does not account for or can't be applied to chaos, but he who brings order to chaos, in this case, uh, manifests himself as sovereign. So if you apply order to chaos in a political sense, that is, and actually in a metaphysical sense, like if you think about God doing it, you are sovereign in this way. So the exception is necessary for the rule, as the rule came to be by the sovereign act of the exception. So this is to say that the act of men creating the general law is not a norm, as it's not done by most people, but it's done by a minority. So the exception exists in relation to the rule, as the exception must be an exception of a rule, not an isolated thing in itself. It is always an exception of something. So you can't really have, it's like having contingency without necessity, that they require one another. And the very act of creating the rule or the general state of affairs. Well, not the state of affairs, but just the state of order, or the state itself, the political state. That requires an exception. It requires a sort of breaking away of normality from the general sort of state of affairs to create this artificial state which rules over other people. So the act of this genesis of the state, you could say, is also an act of sovereign exception. Oftentimes, traditional methods of organization are changed to adapt to new problems that need to be faced. This is also why the exception exists, because in order to do this, in order to change and adapt, you need to have this exception. You need to have this sort of sovereignty in the state, in the political system. Sovereignty is to be understood as the highest, underived, and politically independent power. This definition is a sort of formula that can be applied to all systems of power. It is also the final authority to be answered to, and there's really nothing above it, or else it wouldn't be sovereign by definition. Schmidt states that the highest order of competence is found not in the state itself, but rather in the sovereign order in the system of norms or the state. So this is kind of harkening back to the idea that in order to have the exception or the sovereign, you need to have this state around it, this sort of general, or what he calls a homogeneous medium. We could just say like a general order that kind of gives it a sort of contrast to sort of give it being, to know that this is the sovereign, um, the sovereign above all else, basically, more or less. In order for norms to be accepted and prescribed to society, which is then the basis for law, it must first be grounded or justified by another norm. You can't have a norm without already having a system which determines what a norm is and is not. And that system or method itself is a norm. So you need to have, there is a way. So before you create a norm, you need to have a system to identify a norm. This could be a philosophical system. Uh, really, any system itself requires it to be a norm. So any form of order is a norm, basically. Schmidt says the state is confined to producing and writing up law, and is also the genesis of the state is above law. So the genesis of the state is above law and is the source of law. Law then cannot therefore be prior to state, because for law to exist it requires a state, basically. States in themselves are not sovereign. They are rather the medium through which the sovereign can act, and the state itself finds its genesis in the sovereign rather than the other way around. This is why the states can be occupied or pushed into positions that the ruling class of those states would not normally accept. So the state is a tool created by the sovereign and the exception. Remember, the exception and the sovereign are interlinked, that they're kind of symbiotically related to one another. Ascription or determinations in law determine norms before they determine anything else. One must ascribe the norm of the general prior to ascribing the laws which relate to the general. Schmidt states that the theories regarding the state are developed from the theories regarding theology, and that there are theories regarding God and his omnipotence, and thus there are theories regarding the power of the state. So the reason this book is called Political Theology is because it's kind of an analogy of the sovereign state. You can view the state and its subjects as being analogous to God and his creation in a way. In theology, there is the notion of the miracle, which is an event or a singularity disrupting the normal state of affairs. In jurisprudence, this is known as what we just spoke of before as the exception, which is also an event or singularity disrupting the normal state of affairs, politically speaking. Now, this could be a wide variety of things, but the primal act of this would be the generation of the state itself, and also various forms of the state suspending certain laws or manipulating certain laws in a way to act. The state is like God not only in that its laws are manifest through it, but also that the state, being abstract and all-encompassing, manifests itself in different forms on the subjects it rules, much like God does upon his subjects in his various revelations to those subjects. The people or the masses are also what comes to replace God in political life, as they in a mass democratic system have dominion over the direction of that system, much like God does in our world. So this also kind of harkens back to the idea that we also see in Juvenal, where he talks about how um, there's a shift from the God-centered state to the sort of man-centered state. So political sovereignty shifts from the divine to the human, and this is sort of seen in the shift from monarchy to democracy, basically. That reflects this shift. The decline in religiosity finds itself in the political first because here religiosity had an immense influence and restricted what could and could not be done on the basis of ethics. So, first, the validity of the Christian ethics was brought into question as it presented a limitation on the political order, and thus a total annihilation of the system of Christianity itself occurred when it was realized it would be easier for the sovereign to rule without its limiting political nature. Now, this is also interesting because you often hear, and again, this is why I said this overlaps so much with the Juvenal, is that you see the church was always a limitation upon the monarchy. It limited what it couldn't do, even financially speaking. So the monarchy always had the incentive, because power also, as a rule, wants to grow. It always had the incentive to sort of find its way around this. And the best way to do that was to sort of undermine the religiosity, the validity of religious law, to sort of increase its own sovereignty, its own autonomy of power. So this is why we see Christian ethics sort of gets undermined throughout history because the ruling class saw that it was a limit on their power, and they would do anything to convince the masses to not believe in this faith because it would limit the power of the ruling class. So it's in their self-interest to undermine Christianity for that very reason. Now that takes time. You can't just say, "Oh, it's false," but over generations, you could sort of manipulate the state of affairs in a way that you can kind of inculcate a sort of atheism or whatever to get rid of it. This is why so many leading intellectuals were always of a bourgeoisie class, and Robert Michels talks about the same thing as goes with revolutions. They're always of a higher class, these people who promote this sort of atheistic worldview. But that's getting off into the weeds here. Let's focus back more on this text. So we have a turn now where transcendence, or a world beyond the one we inhabit, becomes less believed, and a world of immanence takes place, as is most expressed in the Hegelian philosophy. Now, again, with Hegel, you sort of see Hegel, uh, his philosophy leads to this notion of the absolute state, where the state and individual become uh, indistinguishable from one another. The individual is a reflection of the state, and the state is a reflection of the individual. They're almost sort of they're indistinguishable from one another, and it's a very immanent sort of metaphysic. Hegel is a philosopher of immanence, not of transcendence, and this sort of total state, or this state where there's no distinction between subject and and the ruling of those subjects becomes a sort of absolute state. I guess fascism derives some influence from this, and it doesn't allow for what de Juvenal would call the private will. It's just sort of a total homogeneity of the general will over society. So this is also why the Hegelian state is sort of the epitome of this notion of the I guess you could say autonomous human state. By human state, I mean political state. After God, as the point around which the state orbited, lost his place, it was replaced with a new concept of quote unquote legitimacy. That is to say, the validity of the rulers is based on their ability to fill in the needs of the masses and align their will with the general will. And this is where the people replace God. So the will of the people becomes more important than the will of God, and it's used to justify all political action. Whereas hitherto, the will of God was used to justify all political action. That's about it. This was a shorter video. Hope you enjoyed. There's going to be more. We got a lot more political sociology books to go through, political theory, all that sort of stuff. We're going to go through that. We're going to go through some philosophy soon. So yeah, thank you for watching.